Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Barry's Book Reviews. This is episode number 23. And today we're reviewing a short story called Human Decency. The Korean title is 인간에대한예의. Apologies for my terrible Korean pronunciation. But it's quite a famous short story by one of Korea's most successful writers, Gong Jiyoung. Gong is one of the key writers of the 386 generation of writers. What is the 386 generation? So the 386 generation refers to people who were born in the 1960s, who were sort of politically engaged in the democracy movement in the 1980s, and then became influential in shaping Korea's politics when they were in their 30s. In the 1990s. So the 386 in their 30s in the 1990s, active in the democratic movement in the 80s, and born in the 1960s. So the 386 generation. And Gong is also seen as one of the trailblazing and leading female writers of her generation, along with writers like Oh Chong-hee and Shin Kyung-suk. She's one of the big names of that era. She made her debut back in 1988, and she's published several best-selling novels in Korea. She's got lots of fans. Her novels have sold a lot of copies, and she's very popular. So some of her books have been made. Some of her books have been translated into English. So My Sister Bong Soon was translated into English. I'll try and review that sometime. Our Happy Time was also translated into English. And quite a few of her books have also been adapted into movies. So Our Happy Time was adapted into a really good movie, which you might be able to find somewhere. Uri Duri Hengbokhan Shigan. So you might be able to find that online somewhere. There's also a movie adaptation of this, Dogani, which translates as Silenced, based on a true story. The novel of this, I think the novel has actually been translated by the people who translated today's story, Bruce and Ju-Chan Fulton, but it hasn't been published yet. At least that's what I understand. But hopefully we'll get the novel adaptation of that. The English translation of that sometime. Today's story has actually been published quite a few times, right? Human Decency, it's seen as one of Gong's key short stories, maybe her most famous short story, and it's been published 3 times, right? It was initially published in Korean back in 1993, and like I said, the English translation is by Bruce and Ju-Chan Fulton. Who are very talented and capable translators. We've reviewed some of their translations already, and there's lots of their other translations on the shelves behind me. I'll try and review them at some point soon, but very prolific translators. And the English translation was first published in 1997 in the Wayfarer collection. I don't actually have the Wayfarer collection. It's like a 1-volume book with several short stories in it. Maybe I'll try and get it sometime, but I don't have it in my collection. But then it was published again in 2006 in the Jimun-dang collection, and again that was like a collection of these sort of famous examples of modern Korean literature, short stories in modern Korean literature. And you can see the rest of the Jimun-dang collection are these books here. I think there was like 25 or 26 of them. But then it was published again as part of the library of the Modern Korean Literature collection. And you can see these are these red books here. So why does this story keep getting republished? Why has it been translated and published in English 3 times? And I think the reason it keeps getting republished is because it finds Gong reckoning with Korea's turbulent modern Korean history, which, the period which she lived through. So the democratic movement of the 1980s, the relative prosperity of the 1990s. And in this story, we see Gong sort of trying to come to terms with the role that her generation has played in these huge events, in these sort of significant periods in recent modern Korean history. So what story is Gong telling in human decency, and how does it reflect on the role of the free 8-6 generation in modern Korean history? So the story is set in the early 90s. It was published in 1993, and I think that's basically the same setting for the story. The protagonist is a youngish woman. Let's assume that she's in her 30s somewhere, and she works as a journalist, and she's a feature writer for a women's magazine. As the story begins, she's working on two assignments, so two quite important assignments. The first assignment is an interview with a former labor activist and protester who's called Kwon Oh-gyu. And Kwon was imprisoned for 20 years at the age of 28 and has just recently been released. And he's published a book, and his book hasn't sold very well. And this interview is a chance for him to promote his life story, promote his book, and also the charity work that he's engaged in. And his life story is desperately sad. He was in prison for 2 decades as a young man, and he's lucky to have survived this experience. Many of the people who were arrested alongside Kwon were executed or tortured or simply died in prison due to the conditions. And our journalist is moved by her interview of Kwon, but she's also struck by the seeming futility of his position. And this causes her to reflect on the people that she herself lost in similar circumstances. So she talks about the classmate who was killed by a tear gas canister, the friend who was taken away and tortured and who later committed suicide, the other friend who was killed by a riot police person's metal baton. And she wonders at the worth of the job she's doing at the moment, working for the women's magazine. Has she abandoned her principles? Was her activist youth, was it worth the pain and loss that these people have experienced? And these questions are then sort of further highlighted and contrasted by the second person that she sent to interview by the magazine. So who is the second interviewee, and how does she represent a different aspect of Korea in the emerging decade of the 1990s? So the other assignment is to interview Lee Min-ja. Lee Min-ja is kind of a lifestyle and meditation guru. So really very early at the beginning of that trend, perhaps, for lifestyle gurus and the spread of meditation, the sort of commercial spread of meditation. But anyway, Lee Min-ja has recently returned to Korea from a kind of spiritual sojourn to India, to several countries in Africa, and various other places. But she's been on this sort of spiritual journey around the world. The journalist's editor, so the editor for the women's magazine, has become obsessed with E's teachings. Also, her book is a bestseller. And so the article on labor activist Kwon is kind of pushed to the back burner. It becomes less important in favor of focusing on the best-selling meditation expert. And when the journalist interviews E, she's very different from Kwon. She radiates contentment and inner peace and tranquility, and the journalist is drawn to E. She feels inspired by her, but at the same time, she also has this feeling of resentment for this, very successful and spiritual woman. E left Korea during the 1980s, so during this decade of sort of activism and the democracy movement, where so many people suffered and the journalist's friends died and had various terrible experiences. E left the country during this decade to travel the world and find her own inner peace. And in contrast, our journalist suffered through that decade as an activist, and ultimately she realizes that perhaps people don't care. She asks, hadn't I escaped the 1980s, that decade to which I had consigned my 20s? The dead were dead, and those who had been released from jail were free. The readers of our magazine didn't care for that sort of story anymore. It was a hit song whose time had passed. And what does this mean for me? What does it mean for her indeed? What is Gong trying to say about her generation and Korean society after the 1980s? So there's a lot of thorny and complicated questions in this story. There's no easy answers or conclusions. One of the main questions which is explicitly addressed is this idea of, can we ever escape the 1980s? The journalist realizes that now in the 90s of the story, people are laughing at the very thought of political activism, of engaging in that type of behavior. It's kind of mocked by people around her. Society seems to have moved on, but what it has moved on to might not have been worth fighting for. She has this sort of suspicion that maybe it wasn't worth the damage that the activist did or experienced. She calls the 90s the decade of great ambition, but at the same time she rants about the discrimination that women face in the home and the workplace and in cultural life in general. So we also hear her sort of raging against the commercialization and consumerism she sees, which is remarkably prescient, really, if we think about modern Korea, 3 decades later. And we hear the journalist says at one point, we speak not of what is right and wrong, but of what we like and dislike. And of course, again, this seems like a remarkably well-chosen observation, and it seems to be even more true now, 3 decades later, than it was in the early 90s. And near the end of the story, the journalist recognizes that at least now it's possible for Lee Min-ja to be different. She can teach people meditation, and she can tell lonely people they're valuable, and that is worth something. It really is a valuable thing for people to be able to hear and to experience. But there's also this very clear condemnation of the direction Korea took in the 1990s. This idea that these, that lifestyle gurus, although helpful, are just helping you cope with a fundamentally flawed situation in society, and that perhaps the activists of the 1980s failed and lost their ideals and lost their dreams. It's a very interesting story, especially if you're interested in these sort of big decades in recent Korean history and these sort of momentous events that happened and the changes that occurred. She's a very, good, Gong Jiyoung's a very good commentator on those things. She has very interesting things to say about it. And, this is a great story which looks at those things, looks at the early years of the 1990s, the aftermath of the 1980s, and it's really just a very interesting story. And like I said, there's 3 versions of it available in English, or sorry, 1 version available in 3 places. So it's Human Decency by Gong Jiyoung, and I recommend it. It's a great story. And this was book review number 23. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.